At the edge of an unforgiving world, a man and a dog find solace in the quiet of a remote cabin trying to outrun the ghosts of their pasts. But the wilderness doesn't just hide secrets, it reveals them, and their world is about to be turned upside down by the one thing they couldn't outrun: the truth. What happens when the bond they share isn't just by chance? What if everything they thought they knew was a lie? Don't forget to subscribe, and comment on your thoughts. Tell us where you're tuning in from. In the frozen, desolate woods of Wyoming, a small, injured puppy, barely a few months old, lay shivering in the snow. His coat, once strong, now frail and matted, barely protected him from the biting cold. His ribs were visible beneath his fur, and every breath seemed to come with a sharp wince. His name was Rex, and he was alone, abandoned by those who were supposed to care for him. The world was silent, save for his faint whimpers. A sharp wind howled through the barren trees, biting at the exposed skin of the puppy as he lay, his body trembling, his spirit slowly dimming under the weight of his abandonment. His eyes, large and brown, flickered open in the cold, catching the faintest glimpse of the world around him. His paws, raw and sore, tried to push against the snow, but his body had no strength left. Every attempt to rise sent another jolt of pain through him, and all he could do was curl tighter into the cold ground, hoping for some relief that never came. Not far from this desolate scene, a figure moved through the woods. Thomas Carter, a white veteran in his late 30s, trudged through the snow-covered path. His boots crunched with the weight of each step, but the chill of the Wyoming air didn't bother him. After years of military service, he was used to much harsher conditions. The icy cold, the isolation, it was part of the life he had chosen after leaving the service. The world around him seemed empty, and for the most part he preferred it that way. The forest was quiet, save for the occasional rustle of branches swaying in the wind. It was his sanctuary, a place where the past, with all its weight and ghosts, didn't follow him. But today was different. As he walked deeper into the woods, something changed in the air, a sound small but unmistakable. It wasn't the usual noise of wildlife or the wind in the trees. It was a cry desperate and painful, a whimper cut short by the sharpness of the cold. Thomas stopped in his tracks, his military instincts kicking in. His body, trained to react quickly, froze in place, listening intently for the sound again. The cry came again, faint, fragile, but undeniable. It was an animal in pain. Perhaps worse than that, it was an animal in need of help. He didn't hesitate. With a quick pivot, Thomas adjusted his path, moving towards the sound. The snow crunched beneath his boots as he moved with purpose, the air around him sharp and cold, but his mind was focused. The moment his eyes locked on the small form lying helplessly in the snow, his heart sank. There, barely visible beneath the heavy snow, was the puppy. Rex was small, frail, and shaking with cold, his coat matted and dirty. Thomas could see the dog's ribs, the distress in his eyes, and it was clear this dog was barely hanging on. Thomas's breath caught in his throat. He was used to fighting battles both physical and emotional, but seeing something so small and defenseless left a wound in his chest. This was not a soldier on a battlefield. This was a creature abandoned and forgotten, left to die in the wilderness. He couldn't leave it like this. Without thinking, Thomas crouched down, carefully extending a hand toward the puppy. Rex's large brown eyes met his, and for a split second there was hesitation, a flicker of fear. But Thomas didn't move too fast. He knew animals knew how to handle them in moments of distress. He could see the puppy's suffering, and instinctively he spoke in a low, calming voice. "It's okay, little one. I'm not going to hurt you." Rex's body tensed, but the desperation in his eyes seemed to calm slightly. He wasn't used to kindness, not anymore. His body was cold, his bones ached, and his chest felt tight with each shallow breath. But Thomas's gentle presence offered something Rex hadn't felt in days: hope. Thomas reached forward slowly, carefully scooping the weak puppy into his arms. Rex whimpered softly, his small body feeling like dead weight in Thomas's strong arms. The wind howled, but Thomas was focused on getting the dog out of the snow. He pulled Rex closer to his chest, wrapping the pup in his coat, trying to provide warmth, trying to shield him from the elements. Rex didn't struggle, didn't try to fight. His energy was drained, and all he could do was rest his head against Thomas's chest. For a brief moment, everything around them seemed to fade. The world of snow and trees and wind disappeared. There was only Thomas and Rex, two lost souls brought together by fate. Thomas moved quickly through the snow, his breath coming in heavy bursts, his thoughts solely on getting Rex to safety. The wind whipped against his face, stinging, but he ignored it. There was no time to think about the cold. There was only one mission now: save the dog. As he reached his cabin, a small, isolated structure nestled in the heart of the woods, Thomas kicked open the door with his foot. Inside it was warm, the fire crackling softly in the corner of the room. The heat was comforting, but it felt foreign to Rex, who had been out in the cold for so long. His tiny body shivered even more as Thomas placed him gently on the rug by the fire. Thomas stood over the dog for a moment, watching as Rex's breathing began to slow. He wasn't sure how long Rex had been out in the snow, but it didn't matter. What mattered now was that the puppy was alive. That was all Thomas needed to know. He moved toward the fireplace, carefully taking a blanket off the couch and returning to the puppy. With gentle hands, he wrapped Rex up, making sure the warmth of the cabin surrounded him. Thomas knelt down beside him, brushing a hand through Rex's matted fur, his fingers trembling slightly. "You're safe now," Thomas whispered. "You're not alone anymore." Thomas sat by the fire, staring into the flickering flames as they cast long shadows across the cabin. Rex, still wrapped in the blanket, lay next to him, breathing more steadily now, though his body remained weak. The puppy's coat, now warm from the fire, had started to dry, but the frailty of his frame was still painfully apparent. His ribs were visible through his thin coat, and every so often a small whimper escaped his lips. The fire crackled and popped, but the only sound that seemed to matter was the soft breathing of the puppy beside him. Thomas reached down slowly and stroked Rex's head, feeling the stillness of the dog's body. He could tell that Rex was struggling not just from the cold, but from the memories of the cruelty he had endured. Thomas could relate. After everything he had seen in his years of service, the scars were not just physical. He knew what it felt like to carry the weight of a broken soul. But Rex, despite everything, was still alive. That was something. That was hope. And Thomas, a man who had spent so many years in darkness, wasn't going to let that flicker of hope go out. He glanced down at the puppy, who was now looking up at him with wide, exhausted eyes. It was as if Rex understood something had changed. The fear, while still there, had started to give way to trust. Slowly, Thomas reached for a bowl of water from the small table by the fireplace. He had seen how dehydrated Rex was, how weak his body had become in the short time he had been left to fend for himself. Gently, Thomas lifted the bowl and placed it before Rex, watching as the small dog hesitated. The puppy's lips trembled, and he looked at the water, then back up at Thomas. It was clear that Rex didn't know what to do. But after a long moment, the thirst became too much. Rex lowered his head and began to lap at the water, his movements slow and labored. Every sip seemed to take effort, but Thomas couldn't help but feel a sense of relief as he watched the puppy drink. It was a sign. It was a small victory. When Rex finished, Thomas picked him up carefully, cradling him against his chest again. The puppy's weight was nothing compared to the burdens Thomas had carried in his life, but it was enough to remind him that the road ahead wasn't going to be easy for either of them. Thomas hadn't planned on taking on a responsibility like this, but in that moment, as Rex rested in his arms, he realized it didn't matter. He couldn't leave the dog to die alone in the cold, just like he couldn't leave the world to make him into another casualty. Rex was in need of help, and Thomas was the only one who could give it. As the fire burned low, Thomas gently laid Rex back on the rug, covering him with a fresh blanket. He watched the puppy curl up tightly, his tiny body still trembling, but now he was warm, and that was something. It wasn't enough to undo everything Rex had endured, but it was a start. Thomas stood up, his legs stiff from the cold, and moved toward the small kitchen. He opened a cabinet and retrieved a can of dog food, then carefully poured it into a small dish. As he turned to bring it over, he caught a glimpse of Rex, his small eyes already half closed in a fragile sleep. The dog had fought so hard to stay alive, and now in the safety of this cabin he could rest. But Thomas knew this was just the beginning. He wasn't sure what would come next, but he knew one thing. Rex wasn't going to die here. Not tonight. Not while he still had breath in his lungs. The next few days would be critical, but Thomas felt something stir inside him, something he hadn't felt in years' purpose. He wasn't just here to exist anymore. He was here to make a difference, to give this dog, this innocent creature, a second chance at life. He moved back to the fire, taking a deep breath, and allowed himself a rare moment of peace. He wasn't alone anymore. He wasn't just a man fighting his own demons. Now he had a reason to fight. And this time he wasn't going to fight alone. Rex had already been through enough, and now he had Thomas. The next morning, the light filtering through the cabin's small window was soft, casting long shadows across the floor. The air inside was thick with warmth, but outside the biting cold of Wyoming's winter had yet to relent. Rex, still lying by the fire, seemed to sleep a little more soundly, his breathing less labored than the night before. His small frame, though still weak, seemed to have gained some strength. The pain that had held him captive for so long had loosened its grip, and for the first time since Thomas had found him in the snow, there was a semblance of peace in his expression. Thomas moved quietly around the cabin, his boots light on the wooden floor, careful not to disturb the fragile calm that had settled between him and the puppy. He reached into the cabinet and pulled out more food, knowing that Rex would need to eat if he was going to regain his strength. The process of healing both for Rex and for himself was slow, but Thomas had patience. His years in the military had taught him how to wait, how to endure, and how to fight for what mattered. And Rex, though small and injured, mattered. Thomas knelt down beside him, his hand reaching out to gently ruffle Rex's fur. The puppy's eyes fluttered open, and for a moment there was hesitation, as though he wasn't sure whether it was safe to trust again. But Thomas's presence was a steadying force, and after a few seconds Rex's small tail gave a hesitant wag. The simple gesture, so small but so meaningful, made Thomas smile. He had no illusions about how difficult the journey ahead would be for Rex. The dog was still far from fully recovered, and there were likely more challenges ahead. But in that moment, Thomas saw something in Rex that reminded him of himself. A quiet strength, a stubborn refusal to give up. The puppy was resilient, and that resilience would carry him through. "You're going to be all right." Thomas whispered softly his words, more for himself than for Rex. The promise was something he needed to believe as much as the puppy did. Rex pushed himself up on shaky legs, his body still weak from days of neglect, but he moved closer to the food. He sniffed at the bowl, then looked up at Thomas with those big brown eyes. It was as if he was waiting for permission. "Go ahead," Thomas said with a gentle smile. "You need it." Rex hesitated for only a second before diving in. His small body was still stiff, but the hunger took over, and he devoured the food with a desperation that spoke of how long he had gone without. Thomas watched in silence, his mind racing through 1,000 thoughts. He wondered where Rex had come from, who had left him out in the cold, and why anyone would abandon such a beautiful dog. But there were no answers to those questions, at least not right now. What mattered was that Rex was safe, and that was enough. He stood up and walked toward the door, his thoughts still lingering on the past. It wasn't just Rex who was healing. Thomas had his own wounds, ones that couldn't be seen. His years in the military had taken their toll. He had been through things that no one should ever have to endure, and those memories stayed with him, lurking just beneath the surface. But for the first time in a long time, he felt something stir inside him, something that had been buried for years. It was purpose, a reason to keep going, to keep fighting. He had come to this place seeking solitude, seeking peace, but what he had found was a bond, a connection that went deeper than he had expected. It wasn't just about survival anymore. It was about living. Rex finished the food and looked up at Thomas again, his eyes now more focused, more alert. There was still fear in them, a fear that came from the cruelty he had endured. But there was also something else, something stronger. It was trust. Rex was learning to trust again, and that was the first step toward healing. Thomas moved back toward the fire and sat down in the worn chair, his eyes never leaving the puppy. Rex stretched out beside him, curling into a small ball of warmth. It was a simple moment, but for Thomas it was a profound one. The cabin was quiet, save for the crackling of the fire and the soft sound of Rex breathing. For a long time, Thomas just sat there thinking about how his life had brought him to this point. He hadn't expected to become attached to the dog, but there was something about Rex that stirred something deep inside him, something he had tried to bury for years. Maybe it was the innocence in the puppy's eyes, or the sheer will to survive that Rex displayed despite everything that had been done to him. But whatever it was, it made Thomas realize that he wasn't just here to save Rex. He was here to save himself, too. As the day went on, Rex continued to rest, the warmth from the fire slowly filling his small body. Thomas spent the time cleaning up around the cabin, but his thoughts kept returning to the dog. He couldn't help but think about the future, about what was next for them both. He knew that Rex wasn't out of danger yet. He still had a long way to go before he would be fully healthy, but Thomas would see to it that he got there. He wasn't going to let Rex fall through the cracks like so many others had in his life. The next few days passed in a quiet rhythm, with Rex steadily growing stronger under Thomas's watchful eye. The puppy had gained weight, his fur was starting to look shinier, and the desperate hunger that had once driven him to devour every meal was now tempered by a calmer, more satisfied demeanor. Thomas, too, was changing. The days had begun to blend together in a way that felt almost like a dream. He woke up early every morning, the cold biting at his skin, as he went about his routine of checking the woodpile, gathering food, and ensuring that Rex's needs were always met. It was a life of simplicity, but it had a steady comfort to it, a comfort that Thomas hadn't known in years. He wasn't just living anymore. He was surviving, and for the first time in a long time, he was doing it for someone else. Rex was becoming more confident, too. The puppy who had once cowered at every sudden movement now wagged his tail when Thomas walked into the room. It was a small thing, but for Thomas it meant everything. It was a sign that Rex was beginning to trust again, that the bond between them was growing stronger with each passing day. The fire crackled softly in the cabin as Thomas worked on one of his old projects. He had spent most of his life fixing things, whether it was old tools equipment from his military days or the occasional broken-down machine that seemed to find its way into his life. But now his focus was on fixing something else, something more important than anything he had ever repaired before. As he worked, he felt the weight of Rex's gaze on him. The puppy, now more playful, had begun following him everywhere, as though he were afraid to leave Thomas's side. It was as though Rex had found his protector, and in turn Thomas had found a reason to keep moving forward. When Thomas paused for a moment, Rex trotted over and sat at his feet, his eyes bright with curiosity. The bond between them had deepened, and Thomas knew that Rex was no longer just the scared, broken animal he had found in the snow. Rex was becoming his companion, his partner, and in many ways his anchor. It was a strange feeling for Thomas, one that he hadn't expected. For the longest time he had kept to himself, his heart closed off to anyone or anything. The scars of his past, both physical and emotional, had made it easier to shut the world out. But Rex, this small, fragile creature, had cracked open the walls he had built around himself. Rex was the first living thing in years that had made Thomas feel like he was part of something again, something bigger than just the isolated life he had carved out for himself. As the days grew warmer, Rex's strength continued to return. He started to venture outside, more, following Thomas, as he worked around the cabin, running through the snow-covered yard, and even playfully chasing after a stick that Thomas tossed for him. The puppy's energy, though still limited, had begun to bounce back, and Thomas found himself marveling at how quickly the dog was adapting. But even as Rex grew stronger, Thomas knew there was still work to be done. The world was a harsh place, and there were dangers that neither of them could escape. Rex had suffered at the hands of those who had abandoned him, and though he was healing physically, the emotional scars would take much longer to fade. Thomas had his own scars, ones that ran deeper than any physical wound could ever reach. He had seen too much, lost too much, and carried too many burdens to ever truly forget. But as he looked down at Rex, he realized something important healing wasn't about forgetting. It wasn't about erasing the past. It was about moving forward despite it. Rex, with all his vulnerability and strength, had already begun that journey, and so would Thomas. They would heal together in their own way, and they would find peace in the process. That night, as the fire burned low, and the darkness settled over the cabin, Thomas found himself lost in thought. He had started the journey of healing with Rex, but in many ways it felt like Rex was the one who was leading them both. He had no idea what the future would hold, but for the first time in a long time he felt like there was something worth fighting for, and Rex, the small puppy who had been abandoned and left to die, had become the symbol of that fight. Rex's soft breathing filled the cabin as Thomas sat back in his chair, his eyes drifting towards the window. The stars above twinkled brightly, casting a faint glow over the snow-covered landscape. It was a peaceful night, the kind that Thomas had longed for. He didn't know what would happen tomorrow or the day after, but he knew this as long as he had Rex by his side, he would find a way to make it through. As the days wore on, the rhythm of life in the cabin became increasingly predictable, and though Thomas had always appreciated solitude, there was something comforting about having a living creature to care for again. Rex, still growing stronger with each passing day, followed Thomas everywhere, his small body always a few paces behind as they moved through the snow or tended to the fire. It was the first time in years that Thomas had felt this needed, but there was still an underlying anxiety that gnawed at him. He hadn't truly opened up to Rex. He hadn't allowed himself to believe that this bond could mean something more than just another obligation. He had made a promise to himself that he wouldn't get too attached, that it was easier to just care for Rex from a distance. But every time the puppy looked up at him with those wide, trusting eyes, it became more and more difficult to maintain the wall he had built around his heart. Rex was a part of him now, whether he wanted it to be or not. The days were long, the wind howling through the trees, and even though the cabin was warm and quiet, a part of Thomas still felt like he was trapped in the past. The ghosts of his military days lingered, the memories of things he could never forget, never undo. But every time he looked at Rex, those memories became a little more distant. Rex wasn't just a dog. He was a lifeline. And as the snow continued to fall outside, Thomas found himself clinging to that lifeline more than he'd ever expected. On a particularly quiet afternoon, as Thomas was cleaning up from breakfast and Rex lay stretched out by the fire, he heard a knock at the door. It was a light knock, almost hesitant, but it was enough to send a jolt of surprise through Thomas. He wasn't used to visitors, and in fact, he preferred it that way. He stood frozen for a moment, unsure whether he should even open the door. But the knock came again, this time a little louder, a little more urgent. Thomas glanced down at Rex, who had also perked up at the sound, his ears standing alert. "Stay here, buddy," Thomas muttered under his breath as he moved cautiously toward the door. His hand hovered over the handle, uncertainty lingering in his chest. No one ever came this far out into the wilderness unless they had a specific reason. He opened the door just a crack enough to peer outside. Standing on the other side was a man, tall, broad-shouldered, and dressed in worn-out outdoor gear. He looked as though he had been traveling for a while, and there was an anxious expression on his face, something that made Thomas's guard go up instantly. The man's eyes were frantic as he glanced over Thomas's shoulder, seemingly searching for something. "Sorry to bother you," the stranger said, his voice rough with cold. "I'm looking for my dog." Thomas's heart skipped a beat. His mind raced with thoughts of what this could mean, but he kept his face neutral as he spoke. "Your dog," Thomas echoed, trying to keep his voice steady. "What's it look like?" The man shifted uncomfortably, his eyes darting around as though he feared being followed. "It's a German Shepherd mix," he said quickly, as if saying it would somehow make it more real. His name is Duke. He ran off about a week ago and hasn't come back. I've been searching for him ever since. Thomas's eyes narrowed. A German Shepherd mix. The same breed as Rex. A sick feeling twisted in his stomach, but he couldn't let the stranger see his discomfort. How far have you searched? Thomas asked, his voice steady but cautious. The man rubbed his hands together, clearly struggling to stay warm. I've been out here for days just trying to find him. I've got to bring him home. He's just a pup. He's not equipped to survive out here. I've been asking around, but no one's seen him. I heard you might have found him. Please, I just need to know if he's here. Thomas's mind was racing. There was no way this man could know Rex. There was no way he could know what had happened to the dog. But something in the man's eyes told him that he wasn't lying. His gut told him that there was more to this story than the man was letting on. He glanced back into the cabin at Rex, who had perked up even more at the sound of the voice outside. Rex was no longer the scared, trembling puppy he had found in the snow. He was stronger now, more confident, and most of all he was part of Thomas's world. Thomas turned his eyes back to the man who was waiting with desperate hope. He felt a wave of sympathy for him, but also a strong sense of protectiveness for Rex. It wasn't just the dog's physical survival that mattered now. It was the trust they had built, the bond that had grown between them. Rex wasn't some stray that could just be handed back over. Rex had fought for his life, and Thomas had fought for his survival too. I'm sorry, Thomas said, his voice firm. I haven't seen any dog around here. The stranger's face fell, but Thomas saw something flicker in his eyes, a mix of frustration and fear. You're sure the man pressed? He's a big dog, black and tan, with a scar on his leg. Thomas didn't hesitate. The next morning brought a heavy silence with it. Rex had been unusually calm since the stranger left resting at Thomas's feet by the fire, as though he sensed the shift in the air. It wasn't often that visitors came out to the cabin, and when they did it was always for a reason. But now, with the door securely locked, and the last of the stranger's desperate footsteps fading into the distance, Thomas found himself wrestling with a gnawing feeling he couldn't quite shake. Rex stirred beside him, his eyes flicking up to meet Thomas's gaze. The puppy's once frightened look had faded into something warmer, more trusting, yet there was still a faint edge of unease. Rex had been through too much, and now, even in the warmth of the cabin, the memory of the cold and abandonment remained lodged somewhere deep within him. Thomas reached down to scratch behind the puppy's ears, offering reassurance in the only way he knew how. You're safe here, he murmured softly, though he wasn't entirely sure if he believed it himself. He had promised to protect Rex, but he couldn't shake the feeling that something was waiting just beyond the horizon, something he couldn't control. After the stranger had left, Thomas spent the day in quiet contemplation, as if trying to find a piece of himself in the flickering warmth of the fire. He hadn't anticipated how much Rex's presence would affect him. The bond they were forming felt like something that had always been meant to happen, like some force had been guiding them together, pushing them both toward this shared purpose of healing. But there was still the lingering question. Why had Rex been abandoned? Why had someone let him get so close to death only to come back with a half-hearted plea for his return? Thomas had seen cruelty before, but something about this dog's abandonment felt different. It wasn't just the neglect, it was the disregard for the puppy's very life, like he had no value at all. It stung something deep within Thomas, something he thought he had buried long ago. The fire crackled and popped as Rex nestled closer to his legs. The quiet was broken only by the occasional gust of wind outside. Thomas rose from his chair and moved to the window, his gaze shifting across the snow-covered landscape. His eyes narrowed as they traced the trees in the distance, the mountains beyond that seemed to rise up like an ancient wall. He couldn't explain it, but something felt off. Rex, as if sensing his unease, lifted his head from the floor and padded quietly toward him. The puppy's soft whine broke the silence, and Thomas crouched down to meet him. "What's wrong, boy?" Thomas asked, his voice low and soft. Rex, now standing beside him, looked up at Thomas with those big brown eyes that seemed to see right through him. For a brief moment, Thomas could have sworn that Rex was trying to tell him something. Maybe it was his imagination, but the connection between them felt stronger now, as if they were both tuned to the same wavelength. Thomas sighed and turned back to the window. The snow was falling heavier now, coating the ground in a thick, unforgiving blanket. He wasn't sure what it was that made him uneasy, but he couldn't ignore the nagging feeling that had settled in his gut. Something about the stranger's words about the way he had looked at Rex had struck a chord deep inside him. He wasn't sure if the man was telling the truth, but he had spoken of a scar on Duke's leg, a scar that seemed to match the one Rex had. The man had been desperate, and in desperation people often reveal more than they intend. Thomas couldn't shake the thought that there was something he was missing, something hidden beneath the surface. He wasn't about to let Rex become a pawn in some game he didn't understand, but the feeling lingered nonetheless. As evening approached, Thomas decided to go for a walk outside, needing some time to clear his head. The cold air hit him like a wall as he opened the door, but he welcomed it, the sharpness of it grounding him in the present. Rex, who had been content to rest by the fire, suddenly leapt to his feet, whining softly. Thomas paused for a moment, glancing down at the puppy. "You want to come with me?" Thomas asked, though it wasn't really a question. Rex's tail wagged once before he trotted over to Thomas's side, as if he had been waiting for permission. Together they stepped out into the deepening twilight, the crunch of snow beneath their feet, the only sound that filled the otherwise silent world. Thomas wasn't sure where he was going, but something about the act of moving, of walking through the vast expanse of snow, felt cathartic. Rex stayed close to his heels, always a few steps behind, but never straying too far. The air was thick with snow, and the darkening sky seemed to press in on them from all sides. As they ventured farther from the cabin, Thomas's thoughts drifted again to the stranger. Who was he really? And why was he looking for his dog so desperately? Rex was a part of that mystery, now a mystery that Thomas wasn't sure he wanted to be a part of. They moved through the forest, and Thomas stopped occasionally to let Rex explore, giving him the freedom to move around without feeling confined. It was clear the puppy was still recovering, but there was a liveliness to his movements, now a bounce in his step that hadn't been there a few days ago. Thomas couldn't help but feel a sense of pride. Rex had come so far in such a short time. As they neared the edge of the forest, something caught Thomas's eye. There, standing at the base of a tree, was a small, dark figure. Thomas froze, his instincts flaring up immediately. His hand moved to the side of his coat, where he kept a knife, his eyes never leaving the figure in front of him. But then, as the figure stepped into the clearing, Thomas's breath caught in his throat. It was the stranger, the same man who had knocked on his door earlier. Thomas's heart skipped a beat, and Rex's body stiffened at his side. The man's eyes met Thomas's, and for a brief moment neither of them moved. Then, in a voice that was quieter than before, the stranger spoke. "I wasn't lying," he said, his tone rough. "He's my dog. I need him back." Thomas's grip on the knife loosened slightly, but the tension in his body didn't fade. "What are you doing here?" Thomas asked, his voice low and guarded. The man shifted his weight, looking down at the ground for a moment. "I wasn't sure where else to turn," he admitted, his voice tinged with desperation. "I didn't know who you were, but I had to find him." Thomas's eyes flicked to Rex, who had remained perfectly still beside him, watching the man intently. "You need to leave," Thomas said firmly, stepping closer to Rex. The puppy took a hesitant step towards the stranger, but Thomas's protective instincts kicked in immediately. "This is my dog now." Thomas added, his voice unwavering. The stranger's face twisted with frustration, but after a moment he simply nodded. "I'm sorry," he muttered. After the stranger had disappeared back into the forest, Thomas and Rex returned to the cabin in silence. The air around them felt heavier, thicker, as if the tension from the encounter still lingered in the space between them. Rex, despite his growing strength, stuck closely by Thomas's side, his body brushing against Thomas's leg with every step, as though seeking comfort in his presence. Thomas couldn't help but feel a sense of pride in the puppy's loyalty. It was something that had come so naturally to Rex, even after everything he had been through. The cabin, though quiet and warm, felt different now. The fire crackled softly in the hearth, but the crackling sound seemed distant, as if everything in the room was drowned out by the weight of Thomas's thoughts. He couldn't shake the nagging feeling that the encounter with the stranger wasn't just a random occurrence. There was something more to it, something that didn't quite sit right with him. He had seen enough in his life to know when something wasn't adding up. Rex had a scar on his leg, a scar the stranger had mentioned, the same scar the man had claimed belonged to his dog. Thomas was no fool, he knew what that meant. The dog Rex had been before he was abandoned wasn't just any ordinary dog. He had been someone's companion, someone who had cared for him, or so it seemed. But then why had he been left out in the snow to die? The question gnawed at him, and he knew there was only one way to find the answers he needed. He had to face the truth, no matter how uncomfortable it was. As Rex settled down by the fire, curling up on the rug in front of the warm blaze, Thomas grabbed his jacket from the hook by the door. The cold outside seemed less menacing than it had the day before. He wasn't just heading out for a walk now. He was going to do something he hadn't planned on doing, track down the truth. He had to find out where Rex had come from, who had abandoned him and why. The questions were piling up in his mind, each one building on the last, and he knew that if he didn't get answers, he would never be able to give Rex the future he deserved. The cold air hit him immediately as he stepped outside, the sharpness of it biting at his skin. Rex, sensing the change in Thomas's demeanor, jumped to his feet and followed closely behind. It was as if the puppy had become attuned to Thomas's every move, his every emotion. Thomas's breath came out in visible clouds as he moved through the snow, heading toward the small town a few miles away. It wasn't a long walk, but it was a trek that Thomas had avoided in the past. He had kept to the cabin, kept to himself. But now, with Rex at his side, he felt a sense of purpose that he hadn't felt in years. They passed through the snow-covered woods, the landscape still and quiet around them. It was the kind of silence that Thomas had come to cherish, but it was also a silence that made the weight of his thoughts feel heavier. The town was small, a collection of old buildings tucked along a single street that wound through the valley. It wasn't a place that saw many visitors, especially not in the dead of winter. As Thomas entered the town, he noticed the few people who were out and about gave him curious glances. He was a familiar face, but not one that was seen often outside the cabin. He didn't mind. He liked it that way. But today he had a purpose, and that purpose was to find answers. Rex trotted beside him, his small body moving confidently, though there was still a weariness in his gait. Thomas had learned the hard way that recovery wasn't a straight line. It was a journey full of starts and stops, setbacks and victories. They reached the small cafe in the center of town, a place where locals gathered for coffee and conversation. Thomas knew the owner, an older woman named Helen, who ran the cafe with a steady hand and a warm smile. She had been kind to him when he first arrived in town, offering him a place to sit and a cup of coffee whenever he needed it. She had never pried into his past, but she had always been understanding. He pushed open the door, the bell above the entrance ringing softly as he stepped inside. The warmth from the cafe hit him immediately, and he felt the tension in his body begin to ease. Rex, ever the curious pup, sniffed the air and wagged his tail. Helen looked up from behind the counter and smiled when she saw him. "Thomas, I didn't expect to see you out this way," she said, wiping her hands on her apron. "What can I get for you today?" Thomas hesitated for a moment, then walked over to the counter, his eyes scanning the room. "Actually, I'm not here for coffee today," he said, his voice low. "I'm looking for some information." Helen raised an eyebrow, but didn't ask any questions. She had always been good at reading people, and she knew Thomas well enough to know when something was bothering him. "What kind of information?" she asked. Thomas leaned in slightly, lowering his voice so only Helen could hear. "I'm looking for a dog, a German Shepherd mix. His name's Rex, or Duke, maybe. He's got a scar on his leg." Helen's face softened, and for a brief moment Thomas thought he saw a flicker of recognition in her eyes. But it was gone as quickly as it appeared. "I'm sorry," she said, her voice quiet. "I don't know anything about a dog like that." Thomas frowned. He had expected this. He had hoped for something different, but deep down he had known that the truth was never going to come easily. Are you sure? He pressed. You haven't seen a dog like that around here? Helen looked around the room as if trying to gauge whether anyone else might be listening. There's a guy, she said slowly, her voice hesitant. Comes through town sometimes. Doesn't talk much. He's got a dog that looks like the one you're describing. I've seen them a few times, but I don't know where they're from. He doesn't stay long, just passes through. Thomas felt his heart race, his pulse quickening as the pieces began to fall into place. Do you know where he goes? He asked, his voice sharp. Helen shook her head. No, not exactly. He's been here a few times over the years, but he never stays long. He's usually on his way somewhere else. I've never really gotten close to him. Thomas took a deep breath, his mind racing with the possibilities. The journey to the motel was longer than Thomas had anticipated, the snow heavy and relentless as it continued to fall, blanketing the landscape in a thick, cold shroud. Rex, though still small and tender, kept pace with Thomas, his tail wagging every now and then, as if he understood the gravity of what was happening. They moved through the forest, the quiet of the world around them broken only by the crunch of their footsteps on the frozen ground. The motel wasn't far, but it felt like a world away, a forgotten relic of a bygone era. The road that led to it was barely more than a snow-covered track, and as Thomas approached, he saw the outlines of a few run-down buildings through the trees. The motel, which had once probably been bustling with travelers, now looked like little more than a decaying structure. The sign half-collapsed, barely read Riverbend Motel. The letters faded and chipped, almost as if the place had been abandoned long ago. The wind howled through the barren trees, and Thomas shivered despite the heavy coat wrapped around him. Rex, sensing the tension in the air, stayed close by Thomas's side, his ears perked, his body alert. Thomas could feel the weight of the journey pressing on him, but there was no turning back now. This was where the answers were, and he wasn't about to walk away without them. He stepped toward the motel's door, the soft whine of Rex behind him as they crossed the threshold. The room inside smelled of mildew and age, the air thick with dust that had settled in every corner. The walls were cracked, and the flickering light from a lone bulb overhead cast long shadows across the sparse furnishings. It was the kind of place that people only stayed in when they had nowhere else to go. It was the kind of place where secrets festered and stories were forgotten. Thomas's boots echoed as he walked toward the counter, where a frail woman in her late 60s sat, her hair pulled back into a tight bun. She looked up when she heard the door creak, her eyes sharp but wary. Thomas had expected this. He had seen people like her in the few towns he had passed through, worn down by life, by time, by the lack of anything worth holding onto. She eyed him for a long moment, sizing him up before speaking in a gravelly voice. "Can I help you?" she asked, her tone polite but guarded. "I'm looking for someone." Thomas set his voice steady but low, just enough to carry across the small, empty space between them. "A man who stays here sometimes. He has a German Shepherd mix with him, dark-colored. His name's Duke or Rex." The woman's eyes flickered briefly at the mention of the dog, but she quickly masked the reaction. "I haven't seen him around in a while." She said, her gaze returning to the counter. "Who are you to be looking for him?" Thomas didn't hesitate. "I'm looking for answers," he said, keeping his voice even calm. The woman gave him a once-over, then seemed to consider him for a moment, before speaking again. "He's been here a few times, yeah. Quiet guy. Don't ask questions. Comes and stays for a night or two, then disappears. He's not the kind of man who likes to be found." Thomas felt a wave of frustration hit him, but he held it in check. "Do you know where he went?" The woman paused, her fingers drumming absently on the counter. "Not really," she said slowly, her eyes darting to the window. "He always paid in cash, and he never left any name. But if you're looking for him, I'd try the cabin up north. That's the only place he might go." Thomas's heart skipped a beat. A cabin. He hadn't expected this. The woman's words felt like a trail that would lead him further into the wilderness, into the unknown. But the feeling that had been gnawing at him since the stranger's visit, the sense that something wasn't right now, felt louder than ever. Rex, still standing by his side, whined softly, and Thomas placed a hand on his head, offering what comfort he could. The cabin up north. Thomas didn't know what to expect, but he knew one thing. It was the next step, the next piece of the puzzle that had begun to come together. "Thanks." Thomas said, his voice tight with urgency. He didn't wait for her to respond, just turned and headed for the door, Rex following closely behind. As they stepped out into the cold, again the wind howled louder, as if nature itself were warning him. The cabin was the key. Thomas's instincts told him it was where the answers would be. His mind raced, piecing together everything he had learned. The dog Rex No Duke had been with this man for some time. He wasn't just a stray. This wasn't just a case of abandonment. Something darker was at play. Thomas couldn't shake the feeling that Rex had been caught up in something he shouldn't have been. The cabin up north would hold the truth, and Thomas was going to find it no matter what. The walk to the cabin was long, the snow still falling heavily, covering the path in a thick blanket. The forest around him seemed to close in as he moved further into the wilderness. Rex stayed close, his small frame moving quickly to keep up with Thomas's longer stride. They moved deeper into the woods, the trees towering overhead, their branches bare and skeletal. The silence around them was deafening, the only sound the crunch of snow beneath their feet. Rex occasionally sniffed the air, his head held high, but he didn't stray far from Thomas's side. Thomas knew that Rex was still uncertain, still scarred by whatever he had endured, but he also knew that the dog was becoming more than just a survivor. Rex was becoming his partner, and together they were going to face whatever was waiting for them at the cabin. After what felt like hours, the trees began to thin, and Thomas spotted the outline of a small cabin in the distance. It was barely visible through the trees tucked away at the edge of a clearing, its roof slanted and worn. The place looked abandoned, just like the motel, just like the remnants of the life Thomas had left behind. The cabin stood before Thomas like a relic, a crumbling reminder of a life he hadn't lived. Its weather-beaten walls sagged, the windows dark and uninviting. Yet it was here in this dilapidated structure that Thomas knew the truth about Rex's past awaited him. He could feel it in his bones. Rex, sensing the heaviness of the moment, pressed himself against Thomas's leg, his small frame trembling slightly, but his eyes never leaving the cabin. The dog's trust was unwavering, and in that moment Thomas realized just how much he had come to depend on the puppy's quiet presence. It was no longer just about the bond they had formed out of necessity. It was something more, something deeper. Rex had become a part of him, as much a part of his survival as the breath he took each day. Thomas hesitated for only a moment before pushing open the cabin door, the hinges creaking in protest. The musty air inside hit him immediately, thick with the scent of damp wood and decay. Dust motes floated in the dim light, and the floorboards groaned under his weight as he stepped inside. Rex followed close behind his steps, cautious as if he too understood that this place held answers they both needed. The interior was barren, save for a few scattered items, an old cracked chair, a broken table, a rusted stove. It was clear the cabin had been abandoned for years, left to fall apart, much like the man who had once called it home. The only sign of life was a small pile of items in the corner, items that seemed out of place for such a forsaken space. Thomas's eyes narrowed as he moved toward them, careful not to disturb anything too much. The first thing he noticed was a dog's collar, dark leather, worn with age, but unmistakably familiar. Rex's collar. His heart skipped in his chest as he knelt down, fingers brushing the collar gently. It was the same one Rex had worn when Thomas found him in the snow, the same one that had been torn, frayed at the edges, but still carrying traces of Rex's scent. Thomas looked at Rex, who had stayed a few steps behind his body, still and tense. The puppy's eyes, now wide with confusion and fear, met Thomas's gaze. It was as if Rex, too, recognized the significance of the collar. The truth was closer, now within reach. But as Thomas stood up, his mind racing, he couldn't shake the feeling that there was more to this place than just the collar. He had to know who had left Rex here, why he had been abandoned, and why this man, this stranger, seemed to have played such a pivotal role in Rex's life. A door at the far end of the cabin caught his attention, slightly ajar, as though someone had recently used it. Thomas motioned for Rex to stay close and moved toward it, his hand resting on the doorframe as he peered inside. What he saw made his blood run cold. There on the floor was a makeshift bed, a blanket thrown haphazardly over the dirt. Beside it, a series of old, crumpled photographs were scattered across the floor, their edges worn and faded. Thomas crouched down, picking up one of the photos. The image was blurry, but it was unmistakable. The man he had encountered, the stranger looking for Rex, was in the photo, his arm around a younger version of Rex the dog, as a pup, looking happy, healthy, and very much alive. The sight of it sent a shiver down Thomas's spine. The man's face was full of pride and affection, his smile genuine, but the picture spoke of a time long before the abandonment, before Rex had been left in the snow to die. The sense of betrayal hit Thomas hard. Rex had once been loved, once been cared for. But something had changed, something that had led to Rex's abandonment. The question of why still loomed over him like a dark cloud. He glanced back at Rex, whose gaze had fixed on the photograph. The puppy's tail twitched, a low whine escaping his throat as he stepped toward Thomas, his body pressing close as if trying to make sense of the image before him. Thomas held the photo up to Rex, his heart heavy with the weight of it all. "This was your life," he whispered. "You were loved once." But something happened. He paused, running his fingers over the photograph, feeling the rough edges of time. He needed answers, desperately. His eyes flicked back to the pile of discarded items in the corner, his gaze searching for anything else that might offer a clue. Beneath the photos, there was an old leather-bound notebook, its pages yellowed and fragile with age. Thomas pulled it free and opened it, carefully scanning the pages for any sign of a name or a place that could explain the connection between the man in the photo and Rex. The handwriting was small, tight, and erratic, as though the person writing it had been in a hurry trying to capture fleeting thoughts before they slipped away. One passage stood out. "I promised I would protect you, but I can't keep you safe anymore. The people who are after me, they know about you. I can't take the risk." The words hit Thomas like a punch to the gut. He flipped through the pages, quickly searching for more, but the entries grew more fragmented as he read, his stomach sinking further with each new line. The man had been running, fleeing from something, from someone, and Rex had been caught in the middle of it. The abandonment, the neglect, it hadn't been a choice, not truly. It had been a desperate attempt to protect the puppy from the dangers that had come for them both. But Thomas knew, even as he read the last few lines, that it didn't excuse what had happened to Rex. No amount of justification could make leaving a dog to die in the snow right. Thomas stood up, his heart heavy with the realization that the answers he had been searching for were far darker than he had ever anticipated. Rex was caught up in something bigger than either of them, something that Thomas wasn't sure he was prepared to face. But there was no going back now. The days that followed were marked by an unsettling silence that hung over the cabin like a thick fog. Thomas couldn't shake the images from the journal, the cryptic words about a man on the run trying to protect Rex from an unknown threat. He had spent days contemplating what those words meant, the realization creeping in slowly that the danger wasn't just something from the past. It was still out there, lingering like a shadow waiting to strike. Rex had become more than just a puppy in Thomas's care. He was a part of a story that had already begun long before they met, and the danger tied to Rex wasn't something Thomas could ignore. It wasn't just about protecting the dog anymore. It was about keeping them both alive. The realization hit him like a cold wind. The past would never truly leave them. It was always going to be there, just beneath the surface, ready to drag them back into a world neither of them had asked for. But Thomas wasn't the same man who had walked into that cabin weeks ago, the man who had only sought solitude and escape. He was different now. Rex had changed him, and though he could still feel the weight of his past, his years of service, the things he'd lost, the things he couldn't forget, he wasn't willing to run anymore. He wasn't going to let fear dictate his life, not again, and he wasn't going to let Rex face the same fate he had been abandoned to. The cabin, once a place of refuge, had now become a battleground of sorts. It was no longer just a shelter from the storm. It was a symbol of everything they both had left to protect. It was a place of new beginnings and the final line in a fight for survival. They had nowhere else to go, nothing else to rely on but each other. That thought both terrified and comforted Thomas. Rex was still a young dog, barely over a year old, and though his body had healed from the injuries and neglect, the emotional scars were more difficult to erase. The puppy had learned to trust again, but there was still that lingering wariness, that hesitation in his eyes when Thomas made sudden movements or when anyone approached the cabin. It wasn't something that would disappear overnight. It wasn't something that could be fixed with time alone. Rex had witnessed cruelty. He had been hurt in ways that no animal, no living being should endure. But Rex had also survived. He had fought to stay alive in a world that had tried to strip him of everything, and now he had found Thomas. And Thomas, for his part, had found something in Rex that he had long since given up on hope. Thomas knew they couldn't stay hidden forever. The truth, the danger was going to catch up with them eventually. The man who had abandoned Rex, who had left him to die in the snow, wasn't going to give up easily. And whatever that threat was, whatever secrets lay behind the man's frantic journal entries, they weren't going to disappear just because Thomas had made a home for himself in the wilderness. The reality of it all sank in. They had to face it. They had to confront the past head on. It wasn't a choice, it was a necessity. The world had a way of coming back, of making you face what you couldn't escape. And so Thomas prepared himself. Rex, too, would have to face it. He was no longer just a scared, injured puppy. He had found his place in this world, and he would fight for it. For himself. For Thomas. The morning of the final confrontation came quickly. Thomas had made up his mind to seek out the answers once and for all. He couldn't wait any longer. He couldn't hide from the past, no matter how much he wanted to. The cabin felt smaller now, as if the walls were closing in, reminding him that there was no way out, not until he faced what was coming. Rex was by his side, as usual, his presence steady and strong, just as it had been from the beginning. The puppy no longer hesitated, no longer feared the unknown, as much as he had before. He trusted Thomas, and in doing so, Rex had found a courage he never knew he had. The time had come to leave the cabin behind. They would seek out the truth wherever it led, and whatever danger it brought with it. The snow was still falling heavily, coating the ground in a thick layer, but Thomas wasn't afraid. He knew the path ahead would be treacherous, but he had no other choice. This was the only way to move forward. Rex, once so fragile, now walked beside him with confidence, his head held high, his tail wagging ever so slightly. Thomas paused for a moment before stepping out into the cold, looking down at the dog by his side. "We've got this," Thomas muttered under his breath, more to himself than to Rex. "We're in this together." The puppy looked up at him, his eyes filled with a quiet understanding. He had been through so much, and so had Thomas. But neither of them was going to let fear define their future. They weren't just surviving anymore. They were living. They were ready to fight. Together. With that, they moved forward into the unknown, leaving the safety of the cabin behind, knowing that the answers they sought were out there waiting for them just beyond the horizon. The past had come to find them, but they were ready to face it, to make their stand. Rex and Thomas were no longer two lost souls wandering in the wilderness. They were a team stronger than ever, united by the same purpose. And no matter what came next, they would face it as one. The journey ahead was uncertain, but as they stepped into the storm, they knew they had each other, and that was enough. The truth would come whether they were ready for it or not, but they would face it together, and that made all the difference. The end. If you enjoyed this story, don't forget to like, share, and subscribe for more content like this. Let us know what you think about the plot and where you're watching from in the comments below. We love hearing from you.